Why hello there, my Tanukers. Today I wanted to talk about Castlevania Lament of Innocence, a game I recently played through on Twitch. This is sort of like a review, but I mostly just want to talk about my experience with the game and why it's now my favorite Castlevania game. So, last Halloween, I got Castlevania Lords of Shadow on a spooky sale, and I finally started it a couple of months ago, but I was not a fan of it at all. You might know that Lords of Shadow is actually a reboot of the canon and exists outside of the pre-established Castlevania timeline, but that's not why I dislike the game. I'm actually pretty open-minded when it comes to reboots. The reason I did not like Lords of Shadow is that when I sit down to play a Castlevania game, I naturally expect a very dark, moody, gothic aesthetic and atmosphere. I love gothic stuff. However, after playing the game for about 5 hours, contrary to the title, I had yet to see a single castle, and contrary to the edgy subtitle, it was not very shadowy. Rather, the game had me going through enchanted fairy forests and fighting goblins. Also, the entire soundtrack has this epic feel to it that plays almost constantly and loses its effect very quickly. If everything is epic, nothing is. Long story short, Lords of Shadow is more high fantasy than dark fantasy, and that's the significant issue I had with it. Having this itch that still needed scratching, I started wondering how the older 3D Castlevania games are, since I never hear much about them. So, the next time I made a trip to my local used game store, I specifically kept my eyeballs peeled for either Lament of Innocence or Curse of Darkness. Lo and behold, there was a used copy of Lament of Innocence that must have had recently arrived with its gorgeous box art, so naturally I snagged that. I actually showed it off with some other steals in my last used game haul video, so I'll put a link to that in the description if you want to watch it. Coincidentally, someone in our Discord played through the game soon after I got it for myself, and this just made me want to play it even more so I could talk about it with someone else that has it fresh in their memory. He said his playthrough took about 7 hours, which is probably a lot more typical than what mine would become, as it was pretty apparent early on when it took me 3 hours to pass the first level. This is not due to difficulty, as it's actually a pretty easy game, but due to the fact that I like slowing down frequently so I can more easily talk with chat. Despite it being an easy game, however, which is normally a negative in my book, upon starting the game I was immediately met with what I had wanted from Lords of Shadow. It's super dark, both figuratively and literally. In other words, this would be a game I'd play for its dense atmosphere alone. Not hearing much about the game in advance, the only things I knew going in was that the game served as an origin story to the Belmont line's indefinite career of vampire hunting, and I also was aware of a particular event near the end which I won't spoil, because there really isn't much story to spoil. I think it's best if you see it all for yourself firsthand, since the presentation of the cutscenes is what sells it. The surprisingly good voice acting has this sort of theatrical presentation. Firstly, because everyone makes dramatic bodily gestures when they talk, like aggressively pointing at someone coupled with sound effects as their hands quickly move, a la Power Rangers. The hand movements in Power Rangers were actually inspired by kabuki theater, so that happens to corroborate my point. Secondly, the characters project their voices quite loudly despite being right beside each other. It may seem like they're always shouting unnecessarily loud, which they are, but I thought it complemented the already theatrical physical acting quite well. Maybe this comes off as campy to some people, and they would be right, but maybe my background in theater just lets me appreciate it in a different way and see it as endearing. Speaking of the voice acting, the VA for Leon Belmont, the main character here, really carries the character. The delivery style is so similar to Domon Kashu from Mobile Fighter G Gundam that I eventually started to suspect that it was the same voice actor, but we checked and discovered that it's actually not. This voice actor is a Dave Wittenberg, whose biggest single role seems to be Kakashi from Naruto, but he voices lots of miscellaneous characters as voice actors often do. Leon Belmont is introduced as a very dry character that essentially is just there to repeat phrases but with a question mark to allow for exposition dumps to the audience. However, once the story starts to get going and Leon starts having dialogues with bosses before he fights them, and as he keeps returning to the mentor/guide with more and more information, the character continues to grow on you solely because of the overly passionate voice acting. Next to the voice acting as the other thing that makes this game so good is the soundtrack, which fits the gothic architecture of the interior castle environments perfectly. It's mostly comprised of piano and organ, as one would expect for this kind of setting, but it also contains what can only be best described as German synth pop, which sounds out of place as I say it, but it somehow works in the context and gives the soundtrack an identity that is uniquely haunting. My favorite track has to be Anti-Soul Mysteries Lab. Look it up on YouTube later and you'll see what I mean by German synth pop. So, the atmosphere, music, and voice acting are why I like this game so much. But what about the gameplay itself? Well, it's actually pretty simple, which is not necessarily a bad thing. Coming out after the advent of Symphony of the Night on PlayStation, you would assume that Lament of Innocence follows the same formula but just in 3D, similar to how Metroid would be translated to 3D via Metroid Prime. However, Lament of Innocence is not a Metroidvania, but in fact more similar in structure to the original 2D Castlevania games. Each main level can be played and beaten in any order you want, just like in Mega Man, except there's an actual hub level in this game. It might be more sincere to call each main level a dungeon, since each one has a map displaying floors and even a boss at the end. There are multiple different pathings you may choose to progress through these areas, which may incline some people to call it non-linear, but in reality, the only rooms that require backtracking with items gained later on are all optional, something a true Metroidvania would use to bar places essential for progression. Because of this, Lament of Innocence is actually a very linear game in the abstract. All places are available at any given time, so if you want to go anywhere to advance the game, you literally just walk there, save for a few optional rooms. There are some very light RPG elements and some very light puzzle segments. I say the word puzzle very generously here, as they mostly just consist of asking the player to interact with one thing and then to go interact with another thing, simulating the feel of non-linearity. In fact, in the final level, basically the Wily stage if you're still conceptualizing this like Mega Man, I encountered the dumbest puzzle, quotations around puzzle, the dumbest puzzle I have ever seen in my life. Gameplay-wise, it's fine, it's just so incredibly stupid when you actually stop to think about what it is you are literally doing. I bet the designers just got so carried away with thinking about things in terms of gameplay only that they began to completely overlook the suspension of disbelief. I won't describe the puzzle in question here, because the mere act of me saying it out loud would make me feel stupid by association. And since I'm talking about the end of the game, the climax is actually super hype. The suspense really builds up, and the way in which the final boss sequence unfolds really ups the ante in terms of scale and shock value. It's a very memorable finale. I said I wouldn't spoil any of the story, but here's a post-game gameplay spoiler that I somehow had never even heard about. Okay, so once you beat the game, you unlock the ability to play through the entire game again, but as one of the vampire boss characters from Leon's campaign, completely decked out with his own unique mechanics and a floating arsenal of swords with formational stance changes. As vampires do, he levitates around rather than walking, and this coupled with a lock-on feature that was foreign to Leon make the controls feel more akin to a mech game. I only played a bit of the game like this, so I'm really curious as to what happens when you get to where you fight this character as a Leon. Do you fight and kill Leon, confirming this to be a non-canon game mode, or does your campaign just end when Leon kills you? I really would like to know, so if anyone watching has gotten to that point in the game themselves, please let us know in the comments. There's also a crazy mode that unlocks upon completion of the game, which I assume is merely a difficulty mode, but more interestingly, there is a secret boss that I beat in post-game, but it can technically be reached before you beat the game. I don't see anyone doing that though. Literally, the only reason I knew how to access this boss was because I had someone in chat look it up on the wiki. More gameplay spoilers incoming. I kid you not, it literally requires a series of blind jumps in a pitch black dark room that you already had to go through in a different direction indicated by actually illuminated platforms. The only reason we were clued in enough to look this up is because the game gives you a glimpse of said secret boss in the hub level if you first go down a comedically long set of spiral stairs. At the bottom of the staircase, there's a door you can't open until you get a certain item, that item being the one I had to trial and error my way through to get, only after someone told me precisely where it was, in the pitch black room, because I otherwise had no clue where to start looking. Now, the secret boss himself has the second highest HP of any boss across the whole franchise, although comparing the HP numbers of enemies between different games sounds meaningless to me, since HP is only relative to other enemies within the same game, i.e., it's entirely relative because a high HP in one game might not be a high number in another game, but the wiki seems to think it's a big deal. More significantly, the entire experience of getting to it and fighting it is a nightmarishly disturbing sequence that I would like to forget. The context of what's happening on screen is only exacerbated by the dingy PS2 graphics, and that makes it the most unnerving thing the more you think about it. Let's write it off as a collective fever dream I had with Twitch chat, since that's what it felt like. If there's one message I want to get across, it's that this game is super underrated, and if you're like me in that you were disappointed by Lords of Shadow but still want to play an actual cool 3D Castlevania game, I would give this a shot if you ever acquire the means to. Or, if you actually have played this game before, let me know what you thought about it. As for me, I'm regarding it as my favorite Castlevania game so far, and I'm going to try to get a hold of Curse of Darkness next. Anyways, that is all for now, and I will see you later.